I'm Diane McGarry with Drake at Arts. We are so excited to be sharing our artists with you today. Joining us now is author Grace Talusan. Maybe you're familiar with her from her booklet, which I've seen in so many libraries lately. It's been great. A Book of Life and Death, with the Boston Book Festival 10th citywide read this year. I've seen it all over in different libraries around my area. I hope you have too. It's a wonderful story. Grace was born in the Philippines and raised in New England. A graduate of Tufts University and the MFA program in writing at UC Irvine, she is a participant in the US Fulbright Fellowship to the Philippines and an Artist Fellowship Award from the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Grace teaches the Essay Incubator at Grub Street and at the Jonathan M. Tisch School of Civic Life at Tufts. She is a Fannie Hurst Writer in Residence at Brandeis University from 2019 to 2021. And Body Papers is a winner of the Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing. And it's her first book. Grace, it's so wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Drake at Arts, and Diane and Tom, and everyone who's put on this wonderful arts festival. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. So since you mentioned the One City, One Story, I thought I would read from there, and I'm going to read little bits from a few publications. And we can, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or write them down. We'll have some time I'll answer any questions that you'd like. If you're interested in talking about writing or what, art making means during this time, I'm happy to talk about like anything you want to discuss and that would be relevant for you. So I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from this story called The Book of Life and Death. And it was distributed by the Boston Book Festival's program, One City, One Story. And they made pamphlets, distributed them for free, and also translated into multiple languages, including Tagalog, which is one of the Filipino languages. It's a language I can't read, but it is a country, the Philippines is the country I was born in, and then I've been raised here in the United States. So this is a character who is a domestic worker. She is a maid or a nanny. She's Filipino and she works in her employer's home, which if you think about is a very intimate situation. There's a lot of power dynamics. The people who end up becoming domestic workers, at least in the Philippines, are often very well educated and trained. They are nurses, school teachers. There's just a big discrepancy in the amount of jobs available in people's fields in the Philippines. So you get this pool of workers who are very appealing because they speak English and also are very well trained. So I'm reading from fiction from a character from her perspective, and she is talking about her work as a domestic worker in Hong Kong. The agency sent me first to the Middle East and then Hong Kong. I sent most of my money home, minus the fees from all the hands, catching the crumbs from my pay. I loved Hong Kong, so once my first contract ended, I was desperate to find another job. I wasn't ready to return to Manila. As difficult and lonely as the work was, living in Hong Kong was like living in the future, with its fast subway, high rises, and the most current tech. On Sundays, I met my friends in Central. The other maids passed around horror stories about sleeping on the floor between the children's beds or in the bathtub, and every category of abuse, but what can you do? Bahala na. It's reported that almost 200,000 Filipinos work in Hong Kong, mostly as domestics. And when I would look out at the sea of us on flattened cardboard boxes on the sidewalks, in every open space in the financial center, sharing chismes, gossip, eating food from home, and giving each other manicures and massages, I felt a kind of pride. I could bear another week. We were the invisible for a moment, made visible. When the professor's wife, Jing, interviewed me, she said, "The professor and I plan for a baby, babies. I might have twins, maybe triplets. The fertility doctor said to be ready for anything." Jing seemed slightly embarrassed, but also shimmered with excitement and hope. They didn't want me to call them ma'am and sir, shortened to ma'am sir, a gender non-specific colloquialism. Lincoln Chow, a Chinese American, found the term equally ridiculous, quote, positively medieval. But he did not protest at being called the professor. A year later, when the professor's postdoc was finished, he begged me to accompany them. Jing had never lived outside of Hong Kong, and I was her stability and continuity. She needed a friend. He hired an immigration lawyer to fix my papers, which could eventually lead to American citizenship, that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But rainbows are ephemeral. Before I moved to the other side of the world, I asked to go home again. Before I left, Jing put her face close to mine and said, "Be sure to return to us." I'd seen enough closed doors to know what an open one looked like. 10 years later, I'm with the Chows in Boston, and year after year, the professor says that my green card will come through. So many delays, he says, it's out of my hands. After all these years, I still like to remember Jing as I'd first met her, glowing brightly and dumbly, unaware that she would not become a mother and would have to pretend for the rest of her life that she was unabashedly joyful for those who were. Of all the possibilities for someone like me, I got lucky with the Chows. Even though I know that dreams are for the rich, I wanted to become a school teacher. So many of us in the Philippines tried to stay in the country, but there were no jobs. Don't you think we'd rather stay with our families at home instead of traveling far away for years at a time and living with a family of strangers? Now, college grads stay at home and work for call centers, but those jobs are only for the elite or for those whose English skills are so smooth that they can fool Americans into thinking that they are speaking to a fellow American. And even then, while call center workers live in the same home as their families, in a way, they are also migrants working the night shift while their family sleeps and sleeping the day away while their family lives. Land and ocean doesn't separate them, time does. So that's all I'll read from the Book of Life and Death, which is a short story. And some of the insights and experiences that I had when I lived in the Philippines for 6 months on a Fulbright ended up making its way into this short story, like the bit that you just read about call centers. I don't know if you noticed, but when you call your credit card company or Amazon or some other sorts of um, corporations, I can tell as a Filipino American often that I am talking with a Filipino worker who is manning the call in a call center. And I lived in a place called BGC, Bonifacio Global City. And this was a place in Manila that was full of high rises where these call centers were located. And the call centers were subcontracted and subcontracted. So, Amazon, Google, these big corporations were somewhere at the other end of it, but there were many, many people and contracts in between. So it wasn't like these workers were working directly for those corporations. But, when I call my credit card, for example, or some other customer service situation, I can often tell I'm speaking to a Filipino, and I don't know that much Tagalog, but I'll say thank you and give them other indicators that I know that they're Filipino, just as a way to be friendlier. So I wonder if you can tell that, but I mentioned that they don't leave the country to move, which is often what educated workers have to do in the Philippines, but rather they exist during in our timetable. Like they're awake when we're awake, which there's a 12-hour time difference. So in a way, they are migrants, temporal migrants, and living in this other kind of space because that's what they need to do to earn money. So the other thing that we all know we're living through is the pandemic. And so I had the opportunity to publish two sort of dispatches or essays that appear in these two books right now. One of them is called Alone Together, and the other one is called And We Came Outside and Saw the Stars Again. And so I'm going to read from both of these. They, like One City, One Story, they are things that I wrote for and participated in that are really a way of trying to put something in the world that exists outside of money, for example. Like it's not money as a motivation to write these things, but rather I wanted to participate and put my work and put my voice into it because I thought it was important, even though it was hard. Like when I was asked to participate, I first said, I don't know. I mean, I am living through the pandemic. I don't know that I have anything to say. Usually I need a couple of years to process what I'm going through before I write about it. But my friends encouraged me to try to do something different, which is report and write from where I am right now. And that was its own kind of time capsule, and it was worth noting. So I'm going to read first from Alone Together. And this is an essay I wrote called River of Grief. And I wrote it pretty soon after we, within the first couple of months of the pandemic, and I had no perspective at all. I was just reflecting on like the present moment that I was living through, which now is a few months old. River of Grief. The one constant for me during this pandemic is grief. Grief is an underground river running beneath every waking moment and every activity I do or no longer do in order to distract myself. I grieve for the regular things I've lost, from sitting in crowded cafes to cooking next to my nephew, to sharing an extra large bowl of pho with my parents at the Vietnamese restaurant halfway between our homes, and the once in a lifetime things, my first book's paperback tour. Something will remind me of someone I've known or loved who has died, and I plunge into this cold river. I'm not so overwhelmed that my day is ruined, but the feeling is strong enough that I stop whatever I'm doing and sit with the memory of my dead, who they were to me, all they gave to me, and who I was in their presence. Day after day, the memory of a beloved floats past me, reminders that they are dead, reminders that someday I will die too. I went to the Philippines the summer after my first year of graduate school because my grandmother was dying. It was my third time in the country of my birth since leaving for America at age 2. Sometimes I wonder if the act of migration was the river's original source. What did that rupture from my first language, my loved ones, and my home country do to me? The narrative of migration is often expressed as a one-way move toward a better life. But what and who did I lose by leaving my so-called bad life in the Philippines? Does the multiverse contain the Filipino version of me? We were not able to visit for 20 years because we needed to fix our immigration status. I did not know much about the Philippines, so when my grandmother would stay with us for months at a time, she brought our country to us. I tasted the Philippines through snacks, dried watermelon seeds and crunchy fried corn kernels, and imagined this place through stories from my grandmother. She would braid my hair every night and tie it with white rags torn from an old t-shirt. When I sat between her legs as she parted my hair into sections and tied it into black ropes, I felt normal for once, like one of the American girls in the books I read. When the end was near, my grandmother was moved to a former convent and set up in a hospital bed in the lobby outside of the chapel door so that a stream of visitors, 9 children and their spouses, dozens of grandchildren, other relations, friends, and colleagues from all over the world, could visit with her and then walk steps away to the chapel to keep their promise to pray for her soul's repose. Interacting with her during this time, I often felt as if I were participating in one of her dreams. She raised her arms and waved them, eyes closed as she conducted an orchestra the way she had as a young woman. She bicycled her legs and asked me to follow her to the attic to retrieve her winter clothes from the suitcase she stored in my parents' New England home. She chewed imaginary meals, opening and closing her mouth. Without her dentures in, I was startled to see her remaining teeth, so tiny and mustard colored, ground into stubs. When she was awake, she would acknowledge the people sitting beside me: her husband, her father, her son Eddie, and her sisters. All of them were long deceased. I was told that when we're close to death, our ancestors appear to accompany us on the journey to the afterlife. A few years later, my aunt, the whites of her eyes bright yellow from her failing liver, would see the grandchild who'd been a baby when he died and hear a choir of angels from her deathbed. A day or so before she stopped speaking, my aunt woke up to say that her brother, who was sleeping in another bedroom down the hallway, was shivering from the air conditioning and could someone give him a blanket? The explanation was that my aunt's soul was already leaving her body and roaming to places in her house that her body could not walk to. I was always taught that I have a soul which will live on after my body dies. After death, the soul wanders the earth until the 40th day, an auspicious number for Christians, their judgment day. At the celebration for Lolo Bien, a deceased elder of the family, my 2-year-old nephew Gavin suddenly pointed to the chair at the head of the table and announced to me, "Lolo there." Through hand gestures and the few words he could speak, Gavin communicated that Lolo Bien, clothed in white, was sitting in the chair, appearing and disappearing. There was Lolo waving hello to Gavin, and then he'd hide and come back again, smiling and making the child laugh. When Lolo Bien's family heard this story, they made the sign of the cross. The story left them both delighted and grief-stricken. Even though Gavin was too young to know our beliefs about the afterlife, he confirmed them. Their father was still here. He had shown himself. My mother told me stories about loved ones who died unexpectedly and sent a text message or left a voicemail after their official time of death. 2 recently deceased relatives showed up in reminder messages on her social media and email. Do you want to reply to your message to Ronnie? Do you want to share your memory with Ramon? She interpreted these technological glitches as messages from loved ones reaching out from the beyond to remind her she was loved. All of these visitations by deceased family members are comforting proof that death is not the end, that there are stories about our loved ones existing outside of the body, beyond explanation. So this is from Alone Together. And if you buy this book, it is a fundraiser. All the proceeds go to BINC, which is the charitable organization for indie bookstores. And I've been so grateful for indie bookstores in promoting my book, selling my book. They are these really important community spaces that if we want indie bookstores to exist and have these places to wander into and talk to booksellers and hear what they recommend and meet our neighbors, then we have to support them and buy our books and other things from indie bookstores. So many of them have had a hard time during the pandemic, which is why that anthology exists, and also this anthology exists, which is another anthology that raises funds for BINC, which is the Charitable Foundation for Indie Booksellers. And I was really glad to be able to contribute my writing to it, because I do owe indie booksellers so much. So I'm going to read from my essay in this anthology, and it's called The Arm of Mercy. And this essay focuses on the day that I understood what we were getting ourselves into, I guess, with this pandemic. So I'll read a little bit from there. Moments before we closed our doors to anyone outside of our household, I was traveling with my parents in Texas, a flight or two away from our homes in Massachusetts. Last minute, they had decided to join me for the first leg of my paperback tour for the Body Papers. Their stated reason was to visit with old friends in Dallas. These friends had also emigrated from the Philippines and became like family during our first years in America, but we had not seen each other for years. Also, my parents wanted to sightsee in San Antonio and Houston. This is what they told me, but I knew that they could not bear the idea of their daughter, unaccompanied, sleeping in hotel rooms and driving alone hours from strange city to strange city through an unfamiliar state. Even though I am a middle-aged woman well past child abduction age, my mother imagines that if I travel alone, a maniac in a white van will offer me candy or a box of puppies, and I will follow him unwittingly to my torture and death. After their 70th birthdays, my parents became more serious about doing things from their bucket lists and visiting with loved ones, because you never knew if this was the last time. Every year there were more funerals, and it was becoming harder for them to fill the seats around the table for their weekly mahjong games. My mother began attaching labels with our names to jewelry and other items around the house that she thought we might fight over after she was gone. On Sundays, when my husband and I would visit my parents for our weekly meal together, my father would warn me, "You really need to spend time with your mother so she can teach you how to make her food." But that would require hours, whole days even, that I did not have. If I wanted to cook Filipino food, I would follow a recipe or a cooking video online. And if I had questions, I would call my mother. I would make enough to share with my parents, but when my father would taste my version of chicken adobo or pandesal or sweets such as sans rival or ube halaya, he struggled to politely inform me that there was too much of this and not enough of that. All the criticism led back to his one central complaint: "This doesn't taste as good as your mother's, and once she's gone, you'll be sorry you did not take the time to learn her recipes." I wondered if he thought she would go first and wanted one of his daughters to be able to cook her dishes exactly the way she had. He had no interest in learning these himself. Despite the awareness that death was out there and we would meet it someday, sometime, none of us wanted to talk about it. To imagine the possibility or to utter any of the D words, death, dying, died, in relation to our loved ones felt terrifying. To write about death feels dangerous and unwise, bad luck. I could tempt it to come sooner by writing it down. Our family has seen many of our clan die young. We knew that tragic diseases and fatal accidents were always possible, But now that my parents were firmly in their golden years, the thought of losing them was always there in every conversation and visit, a shoe still undropped. I write this 2 months since everything changed. We know more now than we did back then, but we still don't know enough. When I think about how I made my decision to travel to Texas in early March, I realize that I did not have the proper information to make good decisions. But still, I had enough to know that this virus was something that ravaged one's respiratory system. And as someone with asthma and a recent bout of pneumonia, that could be particularly bad for me. I asked my brother, a physician, for advice. He works in a university research hospital, and I figured he had better information and access. I told him that so far there were no reported cases of the virus in the cities we were going to, but I was more concerned about the virus being at airports and on airplanes. He texted back, "If our parents get sick and die because they traveled with you to Texas, I will never forgive you." After waiting a beat, he added an emoji to show he meant this as a joke. We haven't lived in the same state since college, so my brother stays connected by texting me alarming messages, followed by a just kidding. Every year or so, I'll receive a text from him late at night or early in the morning that reads, "Where are you? You said you'd pick me up at the airport." Or, "It's too bad my sons don't remember you, but that's what you get for not visiting me more often." We were still several days away from using the phrase global pandemic. We didn't know how contagious the virus was. We didn't know that asymptomatic people could spread it unwittingly. We didn't fully appreciate what exponential growth was. And we did not yet know that before the first month was over, my parents would lose their lifelong friend to COVID-19. I'll read from a little bit later in the piece, just 2 more minutes, and then I'll stop and take questions. So please do think about any questions that you have. Um, so one of the things while I was traveling, I got an email from a lifelong family friend in Spain. And if you remember, you know that Spain and Europe was ahead of us in many ways with the virus. So he sent me this email. In the email, Jose apologized for his poor English skills, the length and tone of his email, but he was desperate for us to take him seriously. He was a time traveler, a few weeks ahead of the United States, and he warned about the storm that was coming our way. We needed to heed his warning to, quote, "stay inside." We probably could not imagine what he was describing, but we needed to believe him. Where he lived, they had not acted fast enough against the virus, and we still had time to change what was about to happen to us. He loved us all very much, he wrote, and as I finished his email, I was weighted down with sinking cold terror. Was Jose sick already? Was I sick? Was this the last time we would ever communicate with each other? "Death is all around us," Jose wrote, "and this is what is to come for you." Death was always with us, but like the two funeral homes near my apartment that I drove past all the time, I didn't notice until the virus forced me to. So, excuse me. Again, this is from "And We Came Outside Again and Saw the Stars," which is available, and it's a fundraiser for independent bookstores. And I'm not going to read from my book. I've read from it a lot, and you can find lots of examples of me reading it online. But I do encourage you to support it and get it if you're interested in a book length version of my work. It's a book of, it's a memoir, and it takes all kinds of different things in my life that are unspeakable, I guess, things we don't usually talk about. I found a way to put it in a book, and that's what I wrote about here. And that is generally, if I had to describe my writing, it's generally the things that we don't talk about. I don't mean this only in a bad way or only the traumatic or terrible things either. I try to pay attention to aspects of life that don't make its way into conversation, and to point my attention there when I'm writing and making essays and other things. But thank you for listening to my reading. We have some time for discussion, to hear from you, for me to, address any questions that you're curious about, anything at all that you'd like to talk about. I'm happy to talk about with you. So I know that there are some questions in the chat, so I'm going to have, you want to read them, Diane, or do you want me to?
Sure, I'd be happy to read them. Has writing stories about your family changed your relationship with them? Is writing part of how you process? Do you have to process first before you write? And is there anything you're afraid to write about? Those are three very powerful questions.
They're all wonderful questions. And, sometimes when people ask me this question, and maybe with any question, it's a question that folks might be asking of themselves, whether they are writers or whether it's about talking with other people and telling stories in a more conversational way, or even standing up and doing oral storytelling. I think these are questions that people ask themselves when they're making art or even talking to other people, like, what stories are okay to repeat and what are the consequences of telling a story? And in this particular person's questions, she's specifically focusing on family. And it's probably a question that, would be interesting for me to go around and like interview my family and ask them, now that my book has been out for about a year and a half, what has been their experience? Because I can tell you what I observe and perceive as my experience, as how my relationships have changed. But as we know, everyone has their own story and their own version of things. So they would probably have their own version of what changed in their life, and how they felt about me telling these stories. But I can say that, mostly I was nervous to tell these stories, but because I've been at writing for a long time, it gave me an opportunity to learn from what I saw happen to colleagues and friends who published book-length memoirs and what some of the reactions were. And I also read about what other memoirists wrote about how they approached writing about family. So I had a huge amount of a big treasure of people to learn from. And so I tried to incorporate that into my process. So you don't have to do this. It's not your obligation to do this as an artist or a writer, but I chose to talk to my family about what I was writing. For some of them, I showed them the passages that they were in. I chose to change everybody's names mostly because of the internet. I wanted their names actually aren't important in the story. What is important is the truth of what happened and of what I'm writing. And so I didn't want it to be searchable. And it's kind of interesting because if you look at the Boston Globe, I just saw something recently that they're, because like arrest records are public and make their way into newspapers, I think they're offering people the opportunity to take their names out of those kinds of things. So I feel, glad that I made that decision, so that my family could have that semblance of privacy. So, I went about the process as respectfully as possible, but I also realized that there was a risk, and I I didn't know how people were going to react. They probably didn't know how they were going to react either, because often we don't know what we're going to do until we're in a situation and experience it. But luckily, I think most people, especially my immediate family, were happy for me, proud of me, and understood why I was writing what I was writing. It wasn't in service of anything, at least in my opinion, other than trying to get at some sort of truth, the truth of my life. I wasn't trying to take revenge on anybody. I wasn't trying to steal people's private business just for the sake of doing it. It really was trying to work out some kind of truth on the page, and work out what it means to be honest about my experiences. And as someone who loves books and has found freedom through reading, I wanted to do that myself as a writer and offer that experience really for strangers and people that I'll never meet, who I hope come across my book when they need it. and have a sort of like company with my book. That's what I was hoping for. So that's you'll see that like my family members come to my events all the time. I have family members at the event today. So I think they wouldn't come and attend unless they supported my work enthusiastically, vigorously, were interested in it. They've come to so many things. I would think they'd be sick of it by now, but they still support me and show up and listen to me speak. So I think it's only been positive, a positive response. Which isn't always the case. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen for everybody. And the other questions was about process. How do I process first before I write? And there's a big difference between the voice that I publish, I think, and the voice that I use to process. And I think all of us know this. If you participate at all in social media or even text anybody, right? You're aware of your voice, your public voice that's communicating with a particular audience, whether it's like your Instagram versus your Twitter versus your LinkedIn versus Facebook audience, which to me feels like very different audiences, even if there's overlap between who's there. There's different voices. So I process first to myself in the most raw kind of way. And I use writing as a form of processing and talking too. I talk to all kinds of people and work things out through talking. And I think, we're lucky if we have one or two people in our lives who we can have that relationship with and talk things out. And then, of course, I write. And it's good in a way because writing is a practice. It's like yoga, running, playing the piano. There's so much of writing that no one will ever see, of my writing, that no one will ever see, and no one has to see it because it's me practicing. And then I make a decision about what I'm going to develop and finish and polish and shape for public consumption, whether it ever gets published or not. Sometimes I finish something and no one will publish it. And that's fine too. But I do feel a difference between how I process to myself and what I choose to publish.
So are some of the things that you've put aside that you've decided not to publish, are those things that you're not ready to put out? Or are they things that it's just not something that is worthy in a way? I'm not sure how to best describe that, but I was just thinking about sometimes when I do art, which is not your art at all, I kind of want it to percolate a little bit and to sit there, and that can take years, or that can take 2 minutes.
Yes. I think being whatever art or process you engage in, even if it's the art of conversation and I've heard of people who meet every week. I've read these stories about like friends who will meet at the same coffee shop every day or every week for like a decade, some men's groups even, and will talk to each other. I think that is a really beautiful, creative process as well that reverberates in people's lives in meaningful ways. But I think in terms of like percolating the process of publishing these pieces that came out in those anthologies that I read, it taught me that I don't need as much time as I think. And the other thing that the pandemic has taught me, probably taught all of you, is that we don't have as much time as we think. And what if we did it now? Whatever it is, even if it's going to not be ready or not be in the kind of shape, whatever it would be in, after you processed it, like maybe there's something valuable in doing an attempt now, trying now to see what would come out, and that would be worth it.
A lot of people stay in their apartment because of the virus. They don't walk around the building. It's the only one that walks around. And you don't see too many.
Yeah, so I've heard a comment about, how our lives have changed so dramatically because of the virus. And yes, it sure has. And part of what writers can do and other artists is, use our work or our art or our writing to make sense of it as much as we can in some way. So these other questions are fabulous as well, and I appreciate them. Thank you so much for asking them. I'll read a couple of them. I know we only have a few minutes left. Is there anything you're afraid to write about? And then this question about fiction and nonfiction, how does that feel different to write them? I did read from fiction and nonfiction today. I'll start with the last question first, which is, how does it feel to do those things? And because I had some training as a reporter or a journalist and did some magazine writing, I know what the rules of that, of like the expectations around journalism. And once I started doing nonfiction, creative nonfiction, memoir, personal essay, I felt that there was a different set of rules there even than journalism. And my rule they do feel different to write. Journalism, between journalism and creative nonfiction, there does feel very much like a big difference. And that difference is in audience and in what my goals are. As a journalist, my goal is to report and tell the truth. And, that is with a big, I feel a big obligation to do that. And with creative nonfiction, it's like a different kind of truth. It's more getting at meaning as opposed to a factual truth. And when I write fiction, it's the same. I'm trying to get to some sort of truth through the characters. But I feel a responsibility in all the kinds of writing that I do, to be honest. And that means being honest about a fictional character, being honest about an experience. Because I think when you watch or read or look at something, I think as viewers, you and readers, you feel when something is authentic and honest and speaks to you, versus when something feels disingenuous, manipulative, tricky, so I definitely don't want to do those things. And the other question was about being afraid. I'm afraid every time I write. It's not about, sure, there's some topics that feel riskier than others. And I was watching a documentary that's available on PBS Frontline right now, which I very much encourage you to watch. It's called 1,000 Cuts. It's a documentary film by Ramona Diaz, who's an incredible Filipino-American filmmaker. And 1,000 Cuts focuses on Maria Ressa, who's a journalist in the Philippines. And she's had multiple lawsuits against her. She's been arrested, put in jail for being a truth teller, for being a journalist. You may have heard of Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney is her husband, and she represents Maria Ressa and as her lawyer. And when I watch that and watch what Maria Ressa and other people have to endure every time they open their mouth or report, I know that what I do is tame. Like, I am not in that kind of daily danger of my liberty, money, life getting taken away. I'm not. I'm lucky I live in this country, and this is where I've chosen to do my work. And Ressa has chosen to do her work in the Philippines, and she's in much more physical danger every minute than I am. And so when I knowing about people like her, and there's people like her all over the world, I watched it today, people speaking up and getting taken away by state police in Russia. So, I know that, I'm not in any danger like that. It helps me put things in perspective. But I do feel I'm not doing my work, the deep work as a writer, unless I'm taking a risk in some way. And that means risking a relationship, risking being on the edge of risking something. I don't want to bother doing work unless I'm doing that. So I always feel that way, that I'm afraid. And that tells me that I'm doing the work I need to do if I'm afraid. Tom has a really wonderful question. Do you want to read it, Diane?
Sure. I have to pull up the chat here. Will writing closer in time, as you did for the recent pieces that you just read, change your overall approach to writing?
Thank you, Tom. I think so. I think that, talk about being afraid. Like, I would take years to process an experience before I wrote it. And in my memoir, even 20 years, because I was afraid. I wanted to be right. I wanted to give things time to percolate. I wanted to have enough time to look at all the information and make sure I collected the documents to get things factually correct, and I realize I don't need to do that. And, I can learn from this recent experience that we don't know. It's better to get work done, even if it's imperfect, than not get it done, right? There's that cliche about something about like something is the enemy, the perfect is the enemy of the good, or I don't know, something like that. But we don't know, no one knows how much time they have or what sorts of opportunities they have to put work in the world, and or writing or art or whatever it is, or even conversations. And so there is this kind of urgency to work in a different way, not be so scared, to be able to be wrong. Like maybe if I put work out and I got something factually wrong, like it's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to say, I made a mistake. I want to correct it. Here's an error. I found this document that says this, and that is okay, like for artists to make errors and come back and say, I want to correct it. And that is also instructive. And that's also a courageous thing to do that other people can see. So Lil, thank you for putting this quote in the chat box: perfection is the enemy of achievement. Thank you for that. I've taught writing for a long time. I've taught it to all kinds of people, from kids to high school students to college students to people who have retired from very illustrious careers. Like they were the chief of medicine at their hospital, or they're at the very pinnacle, they're the CEO of a company, and they've waited their whole life to finally write the book that they wanted to write and tell a story. And I think, oh my gosh, why it's so, it's wonderful that they had these careers and other things, but to me, that's a really long time to wait to try something that you love, that you've loved since you were a kid, and to leave it to retirement. I know there's various reasons why people have to do that. They have to like support their families. I understand that. But what I've seen from my experience as a writing teacher is that because they've reached such pinnacles in their career, it is very hard for them to be beginners again. Not all of them, but it's hard because you're like, oh, it's very painful to be a beginner and to work at a skill level that's not as high as I'm used to, because it's, of course we write emails, you write documents, but that's different from this kind of writing about your life or fiction or memoir. It is a different skill set. But, if people like it, they don't have to be perfect. You can just put it out there as alive and imperfect as it is, and there's something to it. It doesn't have to be great. It's I think people can appreciate, your audience, your readers can appreciate what's in there without it being, on like this high level. So I'm trying to see if there's other things, anything else that people had for questions or comments, or things that folks wanted to bring up.
I just love that you added these new books today. I'm very glad to hear about the anthologies too.
Yeah, they're great. It's the one from my publisher, the yellow one, and we came outside and saw the stars again, has translations and dispatches from all around the world, which I think is fascinating to read, what people have written all around the world. And unfortunately, one of our Italian writers in the book did pass away, I think about 2 weeks after turning in her essay for the anthology. She is a translator. Yeah. So, it is real. Like this thing that I said about, like, we don't know how much time we have. I mean, we don't like to think about it, but yeah, Frederica Randall, translator of the unsaid, and the book is dedicated to her and a few other folks.
It's
Yeah.
My dad was very ill for a long time, and it was impressed upon me during that it was very important to say everything I needed to say. And what you're doing is the same thing. You are saying everything you need to say with your artwork, with your writing, and encouraging other people to do the same thing. That's so important.
Thank you. I hope people do. I mean, I think that there's so much we hold back on, and I wonder why. I mean, I know it's hard. Like I can't say that I'm like do it all the time and that it's easy for me, but it is something to press back on, especially during this time. Like, what are we waiting for? Like, is there a good time? And what might transform if we can say what needs to get said? And, if you hang around or are lucky enough to have small children in your life, they haven't been socialized in the ways that we have as adults. And so they have fresh things to say. They have questions that make us think this, rethink and challenge the status quo, because they notice things that we've become socialized to accept.
Right.
I remember like a niece of mine asking, why are only men talking at the dinner table? I think she was 10, and I was like, that's a really good observation. She's right. Why are they the only ones talking? So
There are lots of things like that. It's great.
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any more questions out there? Well, then I will take this opportunity to thank you so much, Grace. I love talking to you. I love hearing you talk about your writing and your process. It's wonderful. If you're interested, you can purchase at least the body papers, and Tom and I will also make sure the other books are available at our bookstore, our gift store on drakeatarts.com. That's a new addition to it. And all our other authors are listed there as well. If you enjoyed this program, please thank our different sponsors. And I think here they are. Yes, Marianne Dorney Goldman, Bill and Laura Nabozny, Blue Shutter Web Design. Let's see. Oh, I'm on the wrong one. Here we go. I have put up the wrong sharing. Let me fix that. I'm sorry. Nope, I did it again. One more time. Hopefully 3 times the charm. We'll see.
Well, I feel so lucky that I've been able to talk with you and be in conversation with you a few times in the past couple of years.
Oh, yeah. Grace, you are a real gift, believe me. Let's see. We also have sponsors to the Massachusetts Cultural Council, Bill Ricca, and Drake Cultural Councils have been administering those for us, and also Diane Song. And if you're interested, and if you've enjoyed this program, please, every little bit helps. We'd love to take donations, even though we're totally online. We have our programs will be all on our new Drake at Arts YouTube channel starting on Monday. All the programs from today will be up. We'd also like to invite you to participate in our cards of appreciation and love. We're collecting Valentines and posters to send to the healthcare professionals around the greater Drake area hospitals and hospices. Just mail them to us, Drake at Arts, 55 Emerald Drive in Drake, Massachusetts, 01826. By February 9th, we're going to deliver them over Valentine's week because these people have been working so hard to help us all. Thank you very, very much. We appreciate all your coming today.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.
Thanks.